the next session is on choice. Before the revolutions in Central and Eastern Europe, I had occasion to visit what was then Czechoslovakia. And I was in a provincial city and saw a huge queue snaking out from the local supermarket, and asked what the queue was about. And they said that they were waiting for a delivery of toilet paper. And I said, well, why would they have to queue? Isn't there plenty of toilet paper? And I was told, no, there is a national shortage of toilet paper. And I obviously looked shocked, and I was asked, well, do you have shortages of toilet paper in your country? And I said, well, no, we never have shortages of something as basic as toilet paper. You know, there's always plenty of choice of toilet paper. And my colleague said to me, why do you need a choice of toilet paper? So I tell you that story because if you remember the title of this event, what would really help consumers of essential services, the first answer which you often get from regulators, providers, government is, well, we'll give consumers a choice. So in this session, we've entitled the session Choice, How Real Is It and How Is It Exercised? And some of the questions which I think we ought to address are, how is market share divided between the sectors of essential services? How is competition currently working or not working for consumers? And more particularly, can competition deliver for consumers in vulnerable circumstances? So the first speaker in this session is Tom Kiedrowski, who runs the consultancy Cedar Advisory Service. I first met Tom when he worked at Ofcom, but he's worked for Ofgem and a whole range of other organisations. Ofwat, sorry. I always get my offs mixed up, and it said Ofwat here. So he's worked for Ofwat. Ofgem he hasn't worked for, maybe he's waiting for an offer. But he's got incredibly wide knowledge, and I'm sure you'll find his contribution very interesting. Over to you, Tom. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Roger. And before I start, I have to say that my local post office is at the back of a Greasy Spoon cafe, and they provide a fantastic service, not least when I need to renew my passport. So long may it continue. So today, I have the task of, in 10 minutes, taking you through choice and competition in just 4 sectors, which obviously will be very brief. But hopefully it will give you plenty to sort of chew over and to ask questions subsequently. I remember when I first started at one of the former sector regulators that I worked at, and I went into the office of my senior director, and she said to me, well, Tom, you know, if there's one thing that the last 300 years have taught us is that, you know, markets are superior to monopoly. And I thought, well, I can't really argue with that. But whilst I might not be able to authoritatively talk about the last 300 years, I can certainly talk about the last 20, what's happened in each of these sectors. And no doubt you have experiences too. And I will sort of conclude by giving some of observations about how competition has been effective and how much effort has actually been put in by the regulators in order to establish it to differing sort of degrees of success. I'm going to start off with one of the sectors that I have worked in for a long time and continue to do so, which is the water sector. Now, obviously, we don't have choice and competition in the household market, neither in Scotland nor in England. But what we have done, and what I was sort of intimately involved in when I was Director of Market Reform at Ofwat, was to go about introducing competition to non-household markets beyond sort of very large users. So now whether you are a corner shop or a hairdresser, or a multinational corporation, you are able to switch your retail provider. And even those figures that I provided there for you, in terms of the number of switches, that was as of February for Mosul. There's new ones, and it shows that there's been over 100,000 switches taking place since the market opened up to competition in England last April. It's more like 1,000, it's about 112,000 now, I believe. And obviously Scotland has had similar non-household competition for a lot longer, because they started in 2008 for slightly different reasons. And in some ways, the graphic, which I borrowed from an organisation, they clearly show some of the benefits that are to be gained from having the sort of choice that is now available in terms of your billing and metering services, people who are able to sort of specialise in those areas, who aren't necessarily wholesale water providers, who don't provide an end-to-end service, but they do understand retail very well, people who are able to help you with your efficiencies, and I think that goes to some of the points that Sharon made in terms of sustainability. And also it has helped because of the nexus between water and energy to sort of reduce carbon emissions, to save water itself, and there have obviously been savings to businesses. That, however, has been obviously quite patchy. And if you speak to business customers and you speak to the water companies, as I do, you'll find that sort of the best deals obviously go to the largest companies. And if you are the local hairdresser on your high street, you perhaps do not get, understandably, the best deals from your water retailer. But there's more than a dozen of them now, and it's very interesting how the market is developing in that area. But what about households? As I said, we don't have competition in the retail market for households. But as part of the autumn statement, the government, in 2015, the government asked Ofwat to assess the cost and benefits of extending it. And the story goes that the reason that that proposal was introduced into the November statement was because of the Chancellor's, one of the Chancellor's SPADs had a bad experience with Thames Water, and the whole document wasn't looking sexy enough. So they said, let's extend competition to the water sector. And I think that's quite an interesting scientific way of introducing policy in this country, which seems to have sort of continued on that theme since then. Ofwat published its emerging findings, and guess what? They think competition is a good thing. They would, wouldn't they? But that's sort of their sort of raison d'etre these days, and they very much believe in markets as a force for good. I'm not saying that I think that markets are not a force for good, but what I do realise is that my experiences for the last 20 years of working in different sectors is you need markets to be complemented with other measures to promote the interests of the consumer, whether they're vulnerable or they're not vulnerable. And let's face it, most of us find that we're in a vulnerable position one way or another throughout our lives. If you look at mental health problems, if you look at affordability issues, life isn't easy, and we've all got various dragons that we have to face in our lives. But it's all gone quite quiet. There's a number of reasons why we haven't heard much about household competition of late. One is obviously Brexit, which seems to affect every single conversation, and the lack of resources that government has to focus on anything else. And also the last general election didn't quite go the way it was planned, at least by Conservative Central Office. So one has to sort of balance the desires to sort of promote competition, if that's what you believe in, versus the sort of political realities. And we haven't quite seen what the smoke has come out of DEFRA on this one. So I'll move on, and you can look at those slides later to see what sort of the average prices are, which I got from Wix in Scotland. Energy, well, that's been a very long process to install competition. If you talk to investors, they'll say, well, we think consumers have got a very good deal in energy. You know, it's us, the poor investor, who has suffered in the UK because of all the regulatory interventions. I think if you're a consumer group and you see what's happened and you look at the margins, certainly of the big 6 companies, It's arguable how much the investors have suffered and how much the consumers have benefited. Suffice to say that the energy market is not a natural market that will just spontaneously appear to meet consumer demand. It is always and always will be heavily regulated. It requires lots of interventions for that competition to appear. Ofgem recognises that, and there have been a series of interventions, the results of which show that the number of supplies has actually increased. The market share of the big six is going down. Prices compared to other European countries, well, they're certainly not the most expensive in the UK, and thank goodness, after all that intervention, you wouldn't expect them to be. The most expensive energy prices for consumers are in Germany and in Denmark. UK is below the EU average, but it's by no means the cheapest. I think if you want the cheapest energy prices, you have to go to Finland to get those. My point here is that Ofgem has recognised that while they want to introduce liquidity in the market, get new entrants in, just as all the other sector regulators have realised, that is not sufficient to protect consumers, and that you also need a series of other interventions to provide greater information to consumers, to empower them to make choices, but also to have safeguards and also to act quite tough in terms of regulatory enforcement. All of those things are required to complement one another. So there's been a lot of confusion and aggregation about switching, but for those who do switch, it's certainly been great. But there is a considerable body of consumers that don't switch. Let's be honest, energy, like a great many of other network industries that ESAN looks at, are homogeneous products. There's not much to differentiate them. They are things that facilitate the rest of your life. How many people actually want to sit for 3-4 hours looking through complex tariff tables in order to make a choice? It's not like choosing a kettle on Amazon. And yet there is this expectation that rational utility maximizing individuals, because of the huge energy bills that they have, which is partially caused by wholesale prices, but is also caused by the fact that we've got extremely inefficient households in this country, mean that we've got quite high bills. And I think the average bill is something like 1,100 to 1,200 a year. And the savings potentially are £200–300 a year from switching. I personally have switched twice in the last year, but how many people are sort of keen to do that? And we have to be sort of realistic about it. And as I said, there has been a lot of intervention both in the market design and now increasingly this realisation that regulators also have to complement that with demand side measures as well. Communications, that's probably been the biggest success story in terms of competition, and it's reflected in the fact that even when John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn look at renationalising some of the key utility sectors, the one they never talk about is renationalising telecoms. Why would you? But they too have found that it hasn't been completely plain sailing. I remember when I was at Ofcom and working on functional separation and the creation of OpenReach, there was a lot of focus on the supply side. If you could just get the market right, if you could just get new entrants into the market, that would be sufficient to protect consumers. And after 2–3 years of functional separation working, not only did Ofcom realise that they needed to intervene more at the wholesale level, but also there was a whole slew of measures that they needed to address in terms of making switching much more consumer friendly and also to protect consumers, which they had chosen not to do in the early years of Ofcom's existence. Communications are obviously ubiquitous. There is a lot of availability. These figures I took from the latest communications market report from Ofcom. As you can see, it's 96% for mobile telephony. Fixed telephony is quite high. there is a lot of broadband connections, but that doesn't mean that the experiences that consumers always have with these companies, particularly when something goes wrong, is very good. Even amongst the mobile operators, which do have the advantage of having nice shiny devices to package with their tariffs, and so make the experience of switching easier. People have not always been happy with when things have gone wrong, and you actually find that in terms of the customer experience, the experience with mobile operators is often quite low, almost as low as sort of dealing with second-hand car salespeople, which is a bit surprising in my estimation. And finally, you have financial services, which is different from the other sectors because the others are former national monopolies that have been privatized and where competition has been introduced. Financial services have obviously always been in private hands until quite recently, when some of them had to go in the other direction following the financial crash. But what happened there was, again, there was this sort of attempt by governments and regulators to look at this from the point of view, well, if only we could increase people to switch their bank accounts, everything would improve. And why didn't people want to switch bank accounts? Well, they didn't want to switch bank accounts because, for example, if you do switch and you need 5 years of information on your financial services to set up a business or to get a mortgage or whatever it may be, you don't want to lose all that data by switching to another supplier. So there's had to be lots of sort of micro interventions by the FCA to try and make that switching much more amiable. You can't simply rely on the market, even though there are, as you can see, a number of suppliers. So it's another market which has seen a lot of sticky consumers. And if you look at other financial products, the idea of switching is even more challenging because, as we saw in some of those videos, the products are not very transparent. The returns come a long way off, particularly with things like insurance and with pensions, and they are just not conducive to sort of quick decision making, and actually require a fair amount of expertise to be able to understand the terminology and to be able to make choices. So that's what I want to sort of conclude with, in that competition was originally seen as a sort of final destination for regulators. After initial privatization, I think everyone remembers that famous bell curve where you sort of ratchet up regulation after privatization, and then as competition kicks in, it sort of disappears and you can leave everything to the market. That's clearly not happened in the last 30 years. In financial services, we've also seen competition being seen as a way to improve quality and innovation and also to drive prices down. But as I've briefly explained, that's not been without its challenges and certainly requires additional interventions to promote the interests of the consumer. I think there is definitely evidence to point to the benefits of competition in all the sectors if you look at it market by market. But there's also evidence that competition between companies and consumer choice doesn't always address all the issues that we face, which have only become more complicated as we deal with other issues, such as the ones that Sharon mentioned in terms of the environment and huge societal changes in terms of the economy and in terms of consumer behaviour. And long-term investors, while they appreciate the desire for better deals for consumers, are looking for greater certainty for their cash and an appetite for regulation. So interestingly enough, when I have meetings with them, they're not too keen on competition either, but for very different reasons. They sort of see the point of competition from a sort of infrastructure point of view, but having lots of interventions and having lots of players in the market creates a lot of uncertainty in the mind, and that results in quite a lot of companies sort of saying, well, we understand why you are promoting competition, O regulator, but in the long term, if you want us to invest in services, if you want to have more resilient infrastructure, you can't just think of it in terms of short-term lower prices for the consumer. Thank you very much.